Hello. These are the readings, a little bit of a commentary, and probably a little bit smaller of a homily for the fourth Sunday of Advent in 2018. This year, that's on December the 23rd, the eve of Christmas Eve. First reading is that famous one from Micah that the Magi hear when they come into Jerusalem. Thus says Yahweh, "You, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too small to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient times. Therefore Yahweh will give them up until the time when she who is to give birth has born, and the rest of his kindred shall return to the children of Israel. He shall stand firm and shepherd his flock by the strength of Yahweh, in the majestic name of Yahweh his God. And they shall remain, for now his greatness shall reach to the ends of the earth. He shall be peace." The word of the Lord. The second reading is from the anonymous author of the letter to the Hebrews. Brothers and sisters, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. In holocausts and sin offerings you took no delight. Then I said, as is written to me, of me in the scroll, Behold, I come to do your will, O God." First he says, sacrifices and offerings, holocausts and sin offerings, you neither desired nor delighted in. These are offered according to the law. Then he said, Behold, I come to do your will. He takes away the first to establish the second. By this will we have been consecrated through the offering of the body of Jesus the Christ once for all. The word of the Lord. The gospel reading is a passage from Luke in which Mary encounters her kinswoman, her relative, Elizabeth. Mary set out and traveled to the hill country in haste to a town of Judah, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the infant leapt in her womb. And Elizabeth, filled with the Holy Spirit, cried out in a loud voice and said, Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And how does this happen to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For at the moment the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the infant in my womb leapt for joy. Blessed are you who believed that what was spoken to you by the Lord would be fulfilled. The Gospel of the Lord. One of the things that I mentioned in the article this week that I wrote is that our sacred authors basically write their writings because they're trying to get their communities to look in the right directions, to be awake, to constantly be, looking at the scenery in front of them that's an ordinary part of their lives, but looking at it through the eyes of faith, that those people are able to see things that a vast majority of individuals that surround them just never seem to notice. I mentioned that years ago. I remember giving some talks down at the Newman Center in Carbondale, and Jack Frecker and I went out to play some video games. This is so ancient of a happening that the only video game available to play was Pong. I think that was the first popular video game in existence. But I used to enjoy playing it, even with Jack, who was very good at it, because if you remember, you old timers, you had a ball that somehow came out from the side of the screen at an angle or at a speed that you couldn't predict, and you had to somehow with a paddle hit that ball. Well, the problem was you never knew where the ball was coming from. And so you constantly had to be alert. You constantly had to worry about it could come from high, it could come from low. I hate to tell you, but I think our sacred authors knew about that game long before it was a game. In a sense, they knew about it because basically they were the ones who were looking for God's actions in their life. Actions that come from any direction at any time. at any speed. And so when we read their writings, for instance, we are constantly made aware of that fact. That's why in that first reading from Micah, Micah brings up something which all Jews were familiar with that kind of caused them to be alert, or caused them to be a little cautious when they dealt with people. Because the greatest king of all time in Judaism, King David, came from a place, Bethlehem, in a situation where no one expected that person to come as king. We remember, if anybody reads that passage in 1 Samuel, that Samuel goes to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem with Yahweh's word that he has to anoint one of Jesse's sons the next king, because Saul, the present king, is screwing everything up. And so when he gets there, he went there on the pretext of offering a communion sacrifice, a big event in Judaism in which an animal is sacrificed, and all the people doing the sacrifice get to share the food from that animal. And so, rather nicely, Jesse brings his oldest son, almost a splitting image of Saul, the present king, and Samuel's almost ready to anoint him when Yahweh says, that's not the one. And so Samuel rather nicely asks Jesse, well, bring the other boys here. So they go through all the boys, none of whom are approved by Yahweh. And so finally, Samuel says, is this the whole lot of the boys? And Jesse answers, well, I got one kid, he's a run to the litter. Somebody had to watch the flock because everybody knew we were going to have this event today here. And so they were afraid, or we were afraid at least, that somebody would put the hooks to the rest of the flock. So David, the youngest kid's out there doing, I guess, security detail or something, watching the animals. And rather nicely, Samuel says, well, bring him in here. And Jesse first says, if these other boys weren't king material, I guarantee you, David's not going to be king material either. And so Jesse finally is forced to do it because Samuel blackmails him to say, we're not going to have that sacrifice. We're not eating till that kid gets in here. And so Jesse finally sends for David. David comes in, and Yahweh says, get your horn of oil ready. This is the one. Anoint him. And so Micah is saying, just like no one could have expected David to be anointed king of Israel, I guarantee you we won't know exactly who the Messiah is either until the Messiah comes. It almost was the Bethlehem scenario in which prophets are saying, you better, if you're going to play the pawn game, be alert, because when Samuel played that game on a holy level, he was very surprised to find where the ball was coming from, who was the one who Yahweh had chosen to replace Saul as king. And so we have to see it from that viewpoint in a way. That's why even in the gospel today from Luke, when Mary encounters her relative Elizabeth, Mary obviously was known to Elizabeth long before the visitation, as we call that event. And in a sense, Elizabeth, by recognizing Mary's uniqueness, is saying, I really didn't notice that before. We could have gone shopping together. We could have sewed very important pieces of cloth as cousins. We could have gotten along quite well. But I just never noticed until now that Yahweh was working through you, through Mary, my relative. How in the heck does that happen? That's why we have to be careful also, because in the second reading from Hebrews, the author is also saying, some of us have the wrong idea about our faith. We think our faith is just offering holocausts again, or offering sacrifices, making amends for sins, or something like that, and not really being out there figuring out what God wishes us to do. Very often that's in the back of our minds, so far in the back, we never bring it to the fore and live our lives of faith like that. We think if we go to Mass on Sunday, send our kids to Catholic school, go to confession every once in a while, go through all the rituals, that we're simply doing what God wishes us to do. That's why I have a quote here today from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's one of the most famous Christians of the 20th century. And he said, being a Christian is less about cautiously avoiding sin than about courageously, on many levels, and actively doing God's will. That our job just isn't not to do something if we can avoid sin, that negative thing, then everything's okay. Especially we Catholics who have this emphasis on sin in our education, at least I did, certainly in Catholic grade school. If we can go through life and avoid it, we've succeeded. Bonhoeffer said, hey, you haven't succeeded at all, because even if you avoid sin, you're not simply doing what God wishes you to do, actively carrying out God's will. We have to see that as part of our life. When I gave my exam in my Bible as Literature class this last semester, my final exam, one of the questions was, tell me why chapter 38 of Genesis is in the Bible. And chapter 38 was known by all Catholics, about the only ones who knew it. It's the Judah-Tamar story. Remember how Judah's oldest son, Hur, is married to Tamar. Hur does something to displease Yahweh, so the text says Yahweh killed him. So then, according to the Levirate law, the regulation that Jews were supposed to follow, that if a man died without children, that his brother was supposed to marry the widow, or at least have relations with the widow, and raise children for his dead brother. And so, even though the kids would have, in this case, Onan, who is Hur's brother, as her natural father, when the kids gathered around the campfire at night and talked about their father, they would mention Hur, because if you died without children in that culture, you really died. The only way you could stay alive was through your children and your grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried on your memory. And so remember, Onan practices a rather primitive form of birth control, and Yahweh is very uptight about that because he won't raise up children for his dead brother Hur. It kills him too. And so there is still another son of Judah. And this guy, Selah is his name. Selah should marry Tamar. So get these names all straight. And I'm afraid Judah's kind of worried about this. Tamar is already a two-time loser. She's killed, in quotation marks, 2 of his sons. So he excuses Selah by saying, well, he's too young right now. Don't call us. We'll call you when Selah's old enough. And obviously he has no intention of ever giving Tamar Judah. Judah has no intention of ever giving Tamar Selah as her husband. And so it doesn't take long for Tamar to figure this out. She pretends at one point to be a temple prostitute along the side of the road. Her father-in-law, Judah, comes by. She seduces him, and eventually she gets pregnant from her father-in-law, Judah. And in a sense, this is carrying out God's will, even though we look at this today and say, I don't think God works through people having relations with temple prostitutes. I'm afraid the author of Genesis 38 is saying, yes, God does work through situations like that. You have to be open enough, because chapter 39 of Genesis, the very next chapter, brings up Joseph in Egypt, the plagues and all the stuff that revolves around the famine in Egypt. And in a way, the Genesis author is saying, to prepare you for the last chapters of Genesis, beginning in chapter 39, let's look at chapter 38. You better get used to the Pong game, in a sense, because you never know from what direction God's actions are coming. If your job is to somehow figure out those actions, at least what you should be doing as part of God entering your life, you better know where to look for God. And God's not going to come in a church building, or God's not going to come with organ music playing in the background. God can come in the most ridiculous ways, as the Judah-Tamar story shows, without any hesitation. That's why when I used to teach the marriage course years ago in our Dawson high schools, I used to stress you have to be careful before you no longer have any questions about your husband or your wife simply and their actions and what they do, in the sense that you know everything that they are going to do. They're very predictable. Because when they become predictable, in a sense, your relationship starts to die. That's why I'm afraid organized religion frequently makes God's actions very predictable in our lives. No wonder we don't have a good relationship with God. We can predict everything God's going to do or isn't going to do. That's crazy if religion does that. If we are a faith based upon biblical faith, we constantly have to be open to looking for God, for respecting God in our lives, in areas and in people we might never have predicted God being present in. Maybe we should have our banner makers in our parishes make a banner with a symbolic Pong logo on it or something, just to remind people that if you can play the Pong game, then you have a little bit of an idea of what the sacred authors are trying to tell us. We constantly have to be open to God's presence, even in people and areas we never would have expected God's presence to be in. Thank you.